The draft notice arrived. Marvin Gaye read it, set it down, and didn't tell anyone for 3 days. What he did next wasn't protest. It wasn't flight. It was something quieter, and in some ways more deliberate than either of those things. The full account of how Marvin Gaye avoided Vietnam has never been told in one place. Most people who know it have never spoken about it on the record. To understand what that notice meant, you have to understand where Marvin was when it arrived. It was 1961. He was 22 years old. He had spent years trying to get inside Motown, playing sessions, recording demos, making himself useful in every way the label would allow. He had tried out for the Detroit Lions that year, briefly, before music pulled him back. Gordy had finally signed him as a solo artist. The first records were out. Nothing had broken through yet, but something was building. You could hear it in the sessions, feel it in the way other musicians listened when Marvin walked into a room. The architecture of a career was just beginning to take shape. Then the United States government sent him a letter telling him to report for induction. This was the period when the draft was becoming something different than it had been. The numbers being called were increasing. The war in Southeast Asia was escalating in ways that the official language tried to minimize and that returning soldiers made impossible to ignore. For a young black man in Detroit in 1961, a draft notice was not an abstraction. It was a door that, once you walked through it, you might not walk back through. And if you did, you might not recognize yourself on the other side. Gordy's concern was practical and immediate. He had invested in Marvin Gaye, not just contractually, not just financially, but in the particular way that Gordy invested in artists he believed were going to matter. He had a specific sense of what Marvin could become, a vision for his career that required Marvin to remain in Detroit, in the studio, accessible. A military commitment, 2 years at minimum, would not just interrupt that vision, it could end it entirely. Careers in popular music did not survive 2 years of absence in 1961. The landscape shifted too quickly, the competition was too immediate, the window was too narrow. Gordy had seen it happen to other artists. He later acknowledged the period without describing it in detail. What he said was that he was concerned. From Gordy, applied to anything beyond commercial performance, that word meant considerably more than its plain meaning conveyed. Marvin's own relationship to the draft was different in character, more interior, more entangled with things he didn't discuss openly. People close to him during this period described someone who was not simply afraid of the military in the way that young men routinely fear it. They described a man for whom the specific environment of military service, the discipline, the institutional control, the submission of individual will to organizational command, represented something that went against the most fundamental thing in his nature. Marvin Gaye was someone who could not be ordered. Not because he was lazy or undisciplined, he was neither, but because the quality that made him capable of producing something in a recording studio that didn't sound like anything else was precisely his refusal to accommodate the expectations of others at the level of his deepest self. That wasn't arrogance. It was the condition of his particular gift. Put that person in a uniform and tell him when to sleep, when to stand, when to speak. The person who came out the other end would not be the person who went in. What reportedly happened in the weeks before his induction physical has been described by people who were close to him, though never in formal public statements. The accounts converge on the same basic picture. Marvin Gaye went into the physical having deliberately made himself unfit. He had stopped sleeping properly. He had eaten badly, inconsistently, in ways designed to produce the readings and physical presentation that would disqualify him. He arrived at the induction center looking and performing like a man who could not serve, because he had spent the preceding weeks ensuring that would be the case. Some accounts add that he presented as erratic during the examination itself, behaving in ways that went beyond nerves, suggesting instability that the board could not pass over. Whether this was deliberate performance or the genuine result of what he had put himself through physically, no one who was there has been certain enough to say definitively. The classification that came back was 4F, unfit for military service. The relief was real. People who saw him in the days after described a man who was visibly lighter, who laughed more easily, who came back to the studio with a quality of presence that had been absent for weeks. He had kept his career, he had kept his freedom, he had kept the version of himself that existed only outside of institutions. But something else settled in behind the relief, quieter, slower to name. Because what Marvin had done was opt out of something that other people could not, and one of those people was his brother. Franklin Gay, Frankie, was 4 years younger than Marvin. He served in Vietnam. Frankie went. Marvin didn't. That asymmetry existed between them for years, though neither brother addressed it publicly in any sustained way that has been recorded. What Frankie brought back from Vietnam was not something that could be contained in a conversation. He wrote letters home during his service, letters that described what he was seeing in the field, the texture of the violence, the confusion of fighting a war that the people in it increasingly understood to be something other than what they had been told it was. Marvin read those letters. He read them in Detroit, at a distance from the thing they described, as someone who had made sure he would be at that distance. Whether that fact shaped how he received the letters, whether it added a specific quality of guilt, or attention, or a debt he felt but could not repay in any conventional way, is not something he described directly to anyone whose account has survived. What it produced eventually was not silence. It was the opposite of silence. What's Going On was recorded through 1970 and released in March of 1971. The album opens with the sound of voices, a gathering, people greeting each other, the texture of a room where something is about to begin. Then Marvin's voice arrives, asking a question that sounds like tenderness and contains something much harder. What's going on? What's happening, brother? What is going on out here? The record is understood now as a protest document about Vietnam, about poverty, about systemic violence, about the widening distance between what America claimed to be and what it was demonstrating itself to be. All of that is accurate. But at its center, it is also the work of a man processing his brother's experience of a war he himself had avoided, trying to hold what had happened to Frankie and to everyone Frankie had served alongside in the only language Marvin fully owned. Gordy refused to release it. The objections were familiar, too political, too uncommercial, too far from what the label did. The confrontation over this record is documented on both sides and is not in dispute. Gordy heard the finished master, sat with it, and said it would not come out. Marvin's position was the same one he had always held at moments of genuine conflict with Gordy. The record releases, or nothing releases. He had more leverage than he'd had at 22, but the stance was continuous with who he had always been. The person who could not be inducted into the military was also the person who could not be conscripted into making music he hadn't chosen to make. Gordy released it. What's Going On became the best-selling Motown single in years. The album rewrote the terms of what a soul record could be, what it was permitted to say, how seriously it was allowed to take its own subject matter. What has been less examined is the line that runs from 1961 to 1971. The decade between them is not a gap. It is the story. A young man found a way out of a war. His brother went and came back carrying something that couldn't be put down. The letters crossed the distance and arrived in Detroit, and Marvin spent years learning how to hold what was in them. There is no clean accounting for any of it. Marvin kept his life, his career, his music. He used that freedom to make a record that spoke for people who couldn't speak for themselves in the same way. Whether that constitutes a repayment or simply describes what happened is not a question the music can resolve. What we know is this: the notice arrived. Marvin read it, set it down, and didn't tell anyone for 3 days. In those 3 days, something was decided. That decision protected him, and cost him, and shaped the work he made for the rest of his life, whether he was thinking about it in the studio or not. Frankie came home. Marvin was there when he did. They never formally addressed, in any form that has survived, what the difference in their experiences had meant to each of them. But What's Going On exists, and the first thing you hear on that record, before Marvin sings a single word, is the sound of people meeting each other again after a long time away. Some of them had been somewhere Marvin hadn't. The music held all of them, the ones who went and the one who stayed, without distinguishing between them. That was the most honest thing he could offer, and given everything, it may have been enough.